on, eh? Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first dialogue on poetics. My name is Michael Nardone. I'm coming to you right now from Anteism Books in Montreal. I am here today with Nora Fulton, author of The Display and Presence Detection System. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your patience while we figured out our first sort of technical system here, where we've got a new broadcasting system here at Anteism Books that we're trying out for today. So first off, I just want to say thank you to Anteism Books for having us here. Thank you to Yoav, Madeline, and Pascal, who are here and setting up the broadcast system. I'd like to thank the Fonds de Recherche du Québec because they're supporting my research right now, of which this is a part, and to the Canada Council for the Arts for supporting Anteism Books with this broadcast infrastructure. And thanks to you for joining us here. Hopefully this is broadcasting to you from the YouTube link that we sent out to everyone. I see thumbs up, so we're everything's working well. And thanks to Nora. Thank you for joining me today. It's a pleasure to have you here. I'll give a proper bio for Nora in case those of you following aren't already familiar with her work. Nora lives in Montreal, Canada, where she is pursuing doctoral studies in English. Her academic research is interested in the ways that the thought of fundamental ontology and poetics in the philosophical tradition might intersect with discourses of transness and trans theory. Her critical work has been published in Music and Literature, The Poetry Project, Radical Philosophy, and elsewhere. Her poetry has been published in Social Text, Hominterm, Tiny Magazine, and more. She is also the author of 3 collections of poetry, most recently The Display from the document series published here at Anteism Books. I'll note that The Display came out during the early days of the pandemic, and that this broadcast is finally the first proper event where Nora will introduce this book to the world. And in addition to that, I just want to say that I've known Nora now since the late 2000s. I came across her work in a workshop at the University of Victoria, and immediately I was just like, who is this person writing these poems? What are they reading or interacting with to write poems like this? They were some of the strangest and most interesting and most exciting poems I had read, and seemed counter to all of the culture of poetry that the two of us were living in at that time. And so it really was important for me to find Nora, to find Nora's work. And I'm so pleased to say that we've had a dialogue going for over a decade now, and one that's crucial for me for thinking about my own writing, thinking about poetics, thinking about language and what it means to be a poet in these times. And so, yeah, I'm really pleased to offer a glimpse of this historic and ongoing dialogue today for this broadcast. So, hello, Nora.
Hi, Michael. I'm glad to continue our historic dialogue too. No one can deny that.
Yeah. I wonder so I apologize in advance if we seem a little bit off in our timing for our listeners. There's a slight delay that we try. That's what we were working on. But I think the sort of disarticulation of our mouths and bodies and voices might actually be an interesting part of many of the things we'll discuss today. But I wonder if you might introduce The Display, which we're here. Can you see this on? Yeah. and perhaps do a reading from it today.
Yeah, so before I do that, I also just want to say thank you to Anteism for hosting this event and for putting together the setup to do this, which is new for them. I think it's great. I'm looking forward to the other events that you have planned in this series. And thank you to you and Nathan Brown, who are the editors of the document series and who basically put this book on paper with Anteism's assistance too. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate the discussion of our relationship because, yeah, I hope you know how appreciative I am of feeling like I have had someone on my side as a poet for a decade, and your work too is something that, you know, it is a dialogue for me to think about the things we talk about, agree about, disagree about. So I'm just happy to be able to let some other people in on that if they're interested. Okay, so I'll kind of summarize the project of the book or what's going on here, and I'll give a short reading 15 minutes after that before we start our discussion. And the book opens with basically what I'm going to say in a more with a more interesting form, but for time I won't read that. That essentially this book is composed out of the kind of textual layers of sedimentation around this didactic poem from ancient Greece. It's usually attributed to Aratus, but comes from a commentary on the philosopher Eudoxus's work, Eudoxus of Cnida, who was a student of Plato. As a mathematician, all of his works have been lost, but Aratus's poem, which kind of takes part of Eudoxus's work and inserts it into a poem, with very little actual understanding of astronomy and mathematics, kind of began this transmission of what we now know as the kind of European canon of the constellations, the formal history of those things. Now, why I was interested in this, it's sort of a continuation of some things I was working on in my last book, Presence Detection System, which ends with a kind of poetic essay on essentially like the relationship between nihilism and astronomical science and anxiety and how that's appeared in literature. There's some echoes here. For example, the river Eridanos is mentioned in that poem in that book. So this is a text I just sort of came across in the wake of finishing Presence Detection System. So probably late 2016, early 2017. And it also coincided with some other things happening in my life that became kind of an array of materials through which I understood the work I was doing on this book. And honestly, it's not something I totally understand. I just worked on this book almost like a habitual thing to distract me from these kind of points that I orient around it. For example, the death of a dog, I knew my transition, contemplations on philosophy that were just coming out of my thinking, and seafaring history too. I don't want to overdetermine all of this stuff, but these are just things going on in the book. So I'm going to read a little bit from it. These are the hottest pathways of the sun. These are the hottest pathways of the sun, and barren most fields appear of ears of corn. When first the sun advances to the lion on the wide sea, alien and full of sudden force, the Etesian bursts whistling, unbefitting of a voyage. Then do broad ships best suit the deep, and then may helmsmen keep the rudder to the wind. If you would see the charioteer and stars belonging to him, if of goat and kid report has reached you, they who oft behold men tossed about on the dark sea, so that the periodical winds of the aeons imbibe. The huge form forms towards the left of the twins, inclining, as you will find. The twister's head in revolve is just opposite. On his left shoulder, the sacred goat, which men say must be preferred, she is both large and bright. But they, the kids, shine somewhat feebly on the wrist of the hand, of the horned bull fallen near the driver's feet. Behold, and very like him lie the stars. Thus is his head distinguished. Another mark is needless to discern the head, since stars on both sides shape it as they roll along. From there we lead the strain, there in whom mankind never leaves inhymned. There are all public ways, all haunts of men are full, and full the sea and harbors, and there all stand in need. We are offspring, and they, mild to man, give favoring signs and rouse us to toil. Calling to mind life's wants, when clods are best for plow and mattock, when the time is right for planting vines and sowing seeds, they tell. Since they hath fixed themselves in heaven, these signs, lo, the stars are dividing. And throughout the year, many stars they will provide to indicate to men the season's course in which things duly grow. What is there, therefore, first and last, the eye must appease? Huddled sire, vast wonder, blessing, star divider, hail earlier breach into the eyes of men, and muses hail. Now some in numbers going their diverse ways are ever drawn by heaven and ever joined, yet never doth the axis change the least. Eye fixed even as it is, and has in midst the earth an equipoise, and carries round the sky, this axis forms on either side a pole. The one we see not, but the opposite of what is high in the oceans of the north, two bears called wains move around it, i.e. maintain the same positions and speeds. To say after that first poem that part of what the text is doing is playing with a scan of this kind of book. There's the first English translation of this poem that I've been talking about from Aratus. So the book itself is filled with moments.
And by a scan, you mean an OCR scan that was put up online. So it's
yeah,
like
the text I'm working with is a digitization of the text. So there are moments in this text that are unreadable that I can't really perform, and I'm indicating those with pauses. So if we cut out during the broadcast, then that's only right. So I'm just going to continue with the reading, and so we can get to our dialogue.
Great.
Okay. Hand plus arm. Much mentioned is their name, and not soothingly are the bomb makers unheard of. They have a place on the whole front of the sky. The left tip and at the adjoining usurer's right foot, their stars are pleased and closely glide. The dog ever leads the usurer in setting, yet as companions do they rise. Because of these suns the woeful sky shall not recline unsung. In truth their names reach unto heaven, for they were and are near. The usurer behind the bear called Trail of Light is like to one who stretches forth both hands. From the tail tip to either foot extends an equal line, the like from foot to foot. But from this girdle one should not look for the first bending of the mighty lake. In front the luckless ones move, but faintly shining in a moonlit night. Few changing stars are those which, ranged around, give the whole sign its name, and make her look bright, even as a folding screen can be fitted indoors. With a key it is thrown back and the bolts are drawn. Such seem the stars beneath her singly placed. And thus from shoulders small she stretches arms. It might be said she sorrowed, for there too moves along a trustful form. Below her, her mother, fairer, seen on moonless nights. So bright her head, so bright her foreshoulders. The outlines of her face and all her robes are her robes, and there too hath she both her arms outspread, with chains upon them even in heaven. Aloft and thus outstretched those hands are ever held. But over her head a horse portentous urges, shows half his belly, and a common star shines at his navel, then upon her head. 3 other stars upon his sides and shoulders betwixt each other equal distance show. Beauteous and great, his head is nothing like us. Nor is his neck, although 'tis choking, the last star of the bright chin can even match the 4 forenamed. And these his form conspicuously girds. 4 feet he hasn't. From his navel's end in demi-form the sacred horse revolves, and he, they say, down from lofty hells brought the pure water from the horse's fount. For from lofty hells pour down no streams as of yet, but the horse will smite it, and the water thence shall flow straight away from the stroke of his forehoof. Shepherds first called this water horse's fount. Down every rock that streamlet flows, and it is seen among the dry sands, but the horse revolves in heaven and can drink it at will. The rapid transits of the ram are there, who truly through round circles is chased. No feebler he runs than doth the bear, trail of light. He himself is faint and starless to behold, in midst of the vast heavens where he moves, just where the cunt and the claw tips revolve. Another sign is formed too, near at hand. Then, yet beyond, toward the southern bounds, the fishes. One is superior to the other. North of these bounds it is better to hear their argument. From both their tails tips extend as if 'twere limits. Each joins with each on each side as they go. These have a star both beautiful and large, and this men call the tail-connecting link. Let the left tip of the cunt of the claw tips mark the more northern fish, for it's nigh, and both her feet she will show. She moves them now in the north, towards the seat of her wife's mother's chair. Her right hand outstretched, wide these steps, hastening, dust-covered even in their retreat. Near her left thigh together sweeps along, no mighty space that holds all. Never mind, now it is not dim enough to see.
That was Nora Fulton reading Hand and Arm from the display.
The radio quality.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah.
2 more pieces. Successors. Herr Georg Nack, in a recent review of the Berliner Philologische Wochenschrift of my monograph Constellation, states broadly that my line of argument rests on a wrong principle, and that I have a sovereign contempt for every historical explanation. The critic, whose tone throughout is that of Zoilos, and whose wrath appears to have been kindled by seeing some notices of my work which spoke of it as epoch-making, leaves astronomy to astronomers, matters historical to historians, and mythology to its contingency. And being thus unwilling or unable to deal with 4/5 of the book, concentrates himself upon a single point, certainly a very important one in its way, namely whether the names of constellations were not originally rather general than special appellations. He believes that these names were at first wider and afterwards became narrowed through a special mythic story, being tacked onto a particular constellation by the arbitrary fancy of some poet. As I reject any such idea, I am, according to him, working on a wrong principle, and the reader must judge between us. He attempts to support this mysterious law by 4 examples. What proof does he give, or can anyone give, for the original names of these constellations? None. Then, regarding the question from an abstract point of view, is it more probable that in the first instance people called a constellation by a name in some way associated with a beast or a bird, by a more general or a more special appellation? I reply undoubtedly by a more special appellation. If a man thought, this constellation reminds me of an animal or of a bird, he would be almost certain to go on in his thoughts to some special animal or bird. And so he did. And constellations reminded him not of an animal, but of a bear, lion, ram, bully goat, dodgy hare. Not of a bird, but of an eagle or a crow or a crane or a piper. But let the name of a constellation be borrowed and brought far from the place where it was first known and used, introduced to foreign nations and translated into other tongues, and then naturally, nay, almost necessarily, great part or the whole of this history is lost. The namesake is forgotten, but the fancied shape of the constellation preserves the name. Say, the kneeler, also the toiler. Had the names of the wonderful discoverer faded utterly, there would still be her molten eye, her piercing threads, halting us upon one knee. So the special bird, whether one or any other, fades from memory, and the asterism dissolves into bird simply. So again, I've given the strongest of reasons. Lastly, we come to the asterism of the river. The naming Georg Nack imagines to be a general one from the start is a mistake, such as almost certain to be made by anyone who plunges into the subject after insufficient study. He next supposes that in the short interval between the time of Eudoxus and the writing of the Phenomena by Aratus, some unknown poet first applied the name Eridanos to the up to that time nameless heaven river. It's curious that he does not boldly assert that the singularly uninventive Aratus himself first identified the nameable river and named. But he quotes approvingly the ridiculous dictum that some poet has invented the names of things, such as rivers. He might have added quite as reasonably that another of them were walking one day, leash in hand, and jumped in alarm at the notice of an unnamed thing guiding them, and that at that instant invented the name dog. Now, anyone who understands the principles of evidence and remembers that some nigh 4/4 of early literature is lost will see at once the worthlessness of the argumentum e taciterne in such a case. There is nothing left in this passage to consider. The world has become so accustomed to explanations which explain nothing that it generally accepts them as if they were veritable revelations. But here, as almost everywhere, we shall find that some reason, whether a strong or a weak one, and not invention or chance, determine the matter, that we have always known in their wonderful discovery our names. And one last piece, short piece, at the end of the book. Our magnitude. From the vault of the sky, from the deeps, on high it sprang and harnessed delight, a strength and a will that does not share in the motion of objects benighted by what tracks the darkness. We mine and illumine it, spewing threads of a looking for, steadily upon the blind setting, the setting for all wisdom, the setting for all truth, a mortal setting of. It is put to flight. The bright ray has been perceived. It extends and pierces the dark immensity, adding gleam to the eye. It is morning below, and it smiles as it flees, where the clouds sail to and fro, the setting for all freedom, the setting for all truth, loosing and binding. The silence names the poles, and the hum of the bee, and the roll of the sea, and their echoes. The wonderful discoverer and maker will not make or discover. Calm speech is mine, like the air of my heaven's heaven. I give, for to me this were given. The light has arrived, the greatest of lights. The birds fly up from their nests. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora. It's really marvelous to hear you reading from this book. It's one that I've seen through a couple earlier versions and in proofs and everything. So, and of course, have been reading several times since it came out this last summer. But it's just really lovely to hear you read from it. I wanted to begin, and I apologize if there's some construction sounds coming through, but but we're in Montreal and there's perpetual construction in every direction. But I wanted to begin with something that you mentioned yesterday. We had a quick chat, and you said this lovely phrase about inviting constellation into your work, and I thought that phrase as a compositional mode, as a readerly mode, was such a fascinating phrase, and something that I think permeates throughout your work. You know, in specifically in the display, you're constellating the Eritrea, the text, its transmissions, its translations, and its commentaries. You're constellating that with the death of your dog, but there's also the discussion of a dog and the visualization of the dog constellation and the dog in the sky throughout the book. There's, there's the transitioning in it and thinking through modes of permanence and mutability that are constantly themes about thinking of the way that the constellations continue and move and shift, and yeah. So I wanted to ask you about inviting constellation and how constellation is a form of composition for you in your books.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you you read it that way. I know that yesterday what we were talking about was not to sort of correct that, but I think what I was saying was that it's almost like I'm offering the temptation to do what is part of the history of this text is all about, which is to mark relationality, and the thinking of like constellation as an act is something that there's a lot of discussion of that in philosophies of relationality. That's something that I'm specifically kind of at least trying in the closing coda of the book, where I do talk about relation and constellation as something that is to be resisted. But what I was saying was like knowing that that kind of activity is going to take place when a work is read, no matter what. I might as well like leave some red meat out there for people to do that work with. And that's something I've done in a lot of books, is I kind of have a proclivity for messing with the reader a little bit, because I see poetry as something that is essentially, it's being read by a small group of people you're thinking alongside, like you, people I'm reading, contemporary and not. So it's more just like not a way of evading that, because, for example, yeah, there are these themes of the disappearance of a kind of shared subjectivity on which this kind of lost dream of a shared ground is just no longer possible here. That's something I'm trying to like undo in the book, because this 19th century text I'm working with is, I think, the perfect example of like the inherent danger of relational thinking, which is that it centers origin even when it might claim to be a way of avoiding something that is happening in this book when this figure who is like, I've altered it to such an extent that it no longer resembles the historical figure, who was not even a well-known philologist at all, but was trying to articulate this like true history, this pure origin in ancient Greece, which is something you find a lot in poetry and philosophy. And part of this book is trying to like avoid doing that, but not in the way that I kind of see that avoidance usually happening, which is through relation.
Yeah, I find that such a fascinating thing, because I mean, you mentioned the coda here, and one of the things that's just so fascinating to me about this coda is this argument that you make against relationality. And I know that you're taking this from the sort of work that you're doing on Alain Badiou. Yeah, and I think of it in relation to behind me we have the book TANYA, LUKIN, LINKLATER, Slow Scrape, which is a book that's founded in relations and founded in really a poetics of relations. So it really very much like developing from glissant to thinking of the way in which there can be some kind of mergence or rupture together. And I find it so fascinating that you're taking this sort of anti-relational mode in your work. It's something that I feel like you've been exploring for a while. You mentioned that essay at the end of Presence Detection System, that as a continuation, and you're thinking about this mode there as well. Yeah. So I'm interested perhaps how you might think of the poetics of these last two books, of how they are or are not intertwined. Something that we've consistently talked about over these years is compositional tactics for writing, methodologies or techniques of composing. And I read this incredible quote of yours, going through some of your work, that you say, I think that if there's an idea that I'm committed to as a poet, it is the idea of the multiple, or the way that Badiou has described being as pure, inconsistent multiple. I read that in relation to the constellation or constellating, and I feel like you're pushing up or resisting against that, or showing that as like a trick in your poetry. But there is the engagement with as you quoted, the pure, inconsistent multiple. And yeah, I'm interested to hear you talk about this and maybe how it impacts your writing processes as well.
Yeah, so there is kind of a dialogue going on with Badiou's work, and I don't want to go on and on about that because I feel like I talk about him all the time. I really don't want to seem like some sort of commentator on his work, because it's work that I struggle with, and it's not something I want to evangelize at all. But the critique of relationality is not that. It's not some sort of privileging of that which stands in relation as autonomous and full in itself, or possessing some sort of reality that relation would obscure or deform. You see these kinds of arguments being made in other circles. It's more that for him, any being already, in order for it to be a being, is already relational, just in order to be able to talk about it at all. It's a composition of relationality. So it's more like it's a redundancy than it's a mistake. And I think where I see that here is like the philological project that I'm interested in, and that I'm trying to kind of turn a little bit and see how that can really exist within poetry. It's like, these are all things I think about in the philosophical tradition as problems, or, things to ground, things to dispute. But in poetry, it's more like, what are their effects? And I just sort of found myself creating these effects while thinking about that, you know. And in that essay, or was it an interview that quote was from? I can't remember.
Yeah, it's from the one that was up on Pank magazine.
With Clara Jones, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Love Clara, but there too, and I feel like all the time I want to just say that I do think when we're talking about modes of poetic composition, those things are separate for me. It's not like the poem is the deduction or the poem is the example or anything like that.
That's great. I'm curious if you might, you know, I feel like in your works that you bring together so many, you know, of course there's this like lovely engagement with the history of thought and the history of philosophy and the history of thinking and the history of language that runs throughout your works in both absolutely serious and absolutely ludic ways of engaging with these things and playing with them, but there are also all of these other sort of, you know, reading through Presence Detection System, you know, I was struck by your engagement with like Japanese culture and Japanese thought that runs throughout that, you know, and yeah. So I'm just curious if you can talk about the different cultures of writing, different cultures of inscription, you know, and art that you see yourself bringing together. You know, I'm thinking of that last essay that is an essay on poetics and is working through, you know, in Presence Detection System of you working through all of poetics, but you do so through such incredibly interesting sources and subjects that throughout. So yeah, I'm curious if you could talk about the sort of cultures of writing and art making that you have been engaging with.
That's a huge question. I guess one thing I would say about that is that even though I have this sort of other track of, you know, doing academic, being in an academic program and working on that kind of material, which there too, I mean, I'm not like, if you know the kind of work that I do, it's not exactly, it's not exactly, it has this almost amateurish feel from my point of view. Like I've always seen myself as someone who stumbles across things and just follows the kind of, you know, who is this person reading? Who are they reading? And the detritus that's left over from that I'm still thinking about, I'm fiddling with, ends up entering poetry in some way for me. But this is in these last few books, and I do think there has been a change in that for me, as I've kind of turned away from thinking about modes of composition, because you mentioned that being something we discuss a lot, and it actually for me it kind of again goes back to this question of resisting Constellation, because I feel like in poetry, especially discussing sort of like contemporary poetry over the last 20, 30 years and trying to ask what's going on there, and ask a question like the one you're asking of like what are you responding to? Where are you coming out of? One of the things I really have never seen the truth in is a kind of grouping of techniques and modes of composition under the label of poetics. Like for me, composition is, it's indeterminate what the techniques you're using are. And actually, I can't really bring myself to replicate any form, like nonce form of a poem. All of my books are kind of like very different, I feel like, even though there are themes between them. But I'm kind of like allergic to that idea of replicability or thinking methodology in itself. I mean, that to me, that's just a means to an end for what poetry is, which I mean is I was joking about this on Twitter the other day when someone asked Emily Zhu, actually, it's a young writer on Twitter, asked, like, does anyone actually know what poetics is? Because it's an overused word in academia, especially. Now I say this even as we're hosted by the Center for Expanded Poetics, right? But
yes.
I do think it's at least the most minimal thing you can say about it is that it's something that you can make a wager on. And I think like what poets are people who like make a wager on what poetics is. And for me, it's kind of a preserving of the possibility of truth. And that's pretty corny. And it's not something that is well articulated in like contemporary modes of poetry that are devoted to thinking relation, the poet's relation to her world, the poet's relation to her tools, in a kind of media focused version of that, the poet's relation to, you know, etc. That doesn't interest me as much as what occasions poetry. So I'm not gonna force that laying of stakes on anyone else, but I just feel like in order to keep thinking about poetry and reading it and writing it, which is such a useless thing to do, as we all know, you have to commit to knowing something about it. Anyway, I don't want to go too far down that.
That's fantastic.
And it's very abstract.
I'm curious what is occasioning poetry for you now after like have you been writing much after these? I know that you're focusing a lot on academic prose right now. I imagine that you are, but yeah, and I know that you're focusing a lot on prose. I mean, someone who we've been discussing recently, who I feel continues to be a large a writer who you're interested in is Laura Riding, continues to be, and specifically you were talking about her prose. Yeah, I'm curious what to use your words, what occasions poetry for you now, and occasions the possibility of you writing in these days.
Well, like I said, I've kind of in the last couple years that's changed a little bit for me, because I think with these last two books, they were really just like an interest in textuality and language. And for example, there's if I can call it a collection, I don't really know if I'm gonna publish it or try to. A number of poems from it or from this kind of period have been published in a few places. And they are very different. I mean, some of them are in prose, some of them are pretty lyrical, but they're kind of occasional works for friends, actually. That's not mentioned in the poem, but I don't really know how to describe them, but I do feel like that's changing for me, and I don't really know why, but I'm sure that if I, maybe it's just because when I was writing Presence Detection System and The Display, I was not in academia at all, and I was kind of doing this autodidactic thing of just coming across pieces as I found them. And now that I'm forced to do that, I don't want to do that in poetry. Maybe, I don't know.
I hear that. I just want to put out there that we have somebody monitoring here the YouTube. If there are any questions for Nora, you know, I said that we would try to keep this you know, close to an hour. We started a little bit late, but I would love if there are any questions, or if you can somehow transmit them to me. I don't know if they're coming in, but. Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say this thing about like just like taking a writer and coming across them and finding out who they're reading. You know, you said this maybe 10, 15 minutes ago, and I remember that being such an incredible thing in terms of meeting you, is the sources for the people that felt like they were giving you license to write the poems that you were writing, you know, 10, 12 years ago, were such a wonderful array of like unexpected sources, and I found that to be just such a fascinating thing, that you were just like picking up and running with these people. And yeah, I don't know. There's nothing. Oh, there's an essay question coming in.
Oh God.
I'm gonna bring it up here. I can bring it up here, and I'll be able to access it. I'm actually happy that there's things coming in through this. Thank you for everybody who's following us on right now.
Just make sure you set it to 144.
Oh, John Luna.
I can't see
great.
the screen, so I don't know if there are any questions.
I'm gonna pause it though, just to cut the feedback. Yeah, good. This is all working. Yeah, John Luna is on. Hi, John. It's great that you're listening. John asks a question about Nora's reference to leaving red meat. For the reader, kind of reminds me of what Anne Carson intro, just a coincidental reference. Oh. I was wondering if, in its quotations of incomplete references, fragmented lyric, almost an imminent lyricism of both the fragmentation of referentiality of both inheritance and absence, with a necessary and cultivated ardor for slippage, a kind of epic form. Are you engaging with a kind of epic form, thinking even a piece of an epic broken off diagrams, its belonging to a performative action of condensation in recitation? And John writes that this is kind of a clunky Nora plus Michael question.
Holy shit, John. Thank you for your poem question. First of all, no, it's not a reference to Anne Carson. I really dislike Anne Carson's work, and I feel like she embodies the kind of cementing of a relational thought of philology and the reference of the Greek classics that I'm not for it. But your other question, I mean, I can answer the part about the epic, which is recently there was an interview with Aaron Winslow on Airlight magazine. Thank you, Aaron, for that. Where he asked about some things that I've been working on recently. One of them is like, just came out of a course I was teaching where I was engaging with the novella form a lot and teaching that. And yeah, that is something I've been thinking about. The question of the epic is something that has been like taken up in Marxist literary criticism, for example, quite a bit by Georg Lukács, and describing a similar sort of like relational worldhood that has been lost with the rise of capitalism and so on. And it's lots of different interpretations of that. I didn't set out trying to like write an epic poem, but it's something I am interested in for sure. And I think like it is definitely in making the choices of composition with this text, which again took place over like 2-3 years of combing through it, subtracting, adding my own writing, deforming words, making this author say the opposite of what he's meaning to say. Of course, I have that in mind in making those decisions, that there's a tone to the epic, of course, that I am interested in. And I did kind of want to find a way to work in that tone. I still do.
Not
So
an
if it's
epic.
anything, it's a tonal thing, I guess. Okay.
Not an epic poem, but possibly a philological poem. Is that something? I mean, could we think of the display as being a poetic work? Because I mean, you're obviously engaging the poetry of the transmission of the text and the commentaries and everything like that, and that helps shape some of the texturing and the tonality of it.
Yeah, we talked a little bit yesterday, kind of a pre-interview, and you mentioned philology, and since then I was thinking, because as I say in the coda, this is a philological story, the story of the transmission of the phenomena. This didactic poem that has been reset and really has no authentic ground to it. Like the original text doesn't exist. It's existed as fragmentations, as annotations on a scientific work, as images, etc. I encountered this after I composed the book, so it wasn't something I was thinking about, but it was actually you bringing that up made me think of this talk at the Center for Expanded Poetics by Petar Milat.
Yes, certainly.
What was it, like 2 years ago? Maybe no, it was a year ago.
Year and a half ago. It was the fall prior to Corona.
Yeah. There's a scholar who was giving this talk on the work of Werner Hamaker and his theses on philology. And I don't know, I'm not an expert on his work at all, but I really like that book. And I like his sort of counter definition of philology that is, I mean, completely against the normative understanding of philology as essentially, yeah, the antiquarian science of the original text, tracing the original text, tracing the genealogy of languages and linguistics. But his work, there's one sort of statement that I would maybe apply to this, where he says, the idea of philology lies in a sheer speaking to and for without anything spoken of or addressed, without anything intended or communicated. And that the elements of language open that which has been said onto which is to be said. So that turn of philology towards a kind of having a futurity and a horizon, and like basically embodied in the subject and in the subject's decisions, was something that's at the essence of the discussion about transition in this book, and the discussion about the passage of time in the book, where some of the temporal sequences are, I reverse them. So yeah, I think that it's almost like a mirror universe philology, maybe.
I love I love the play on time. There's this amazing reference to an image in the coda of the harbor, and the ships leaving the harbor, parallel to a quote that discusses arriving at the harbor just in time to see the harbor itself sail away. And I adore the sort of, something that I continually love in reading your works is just entering into this atmosphere and entering into a tone that is inviting and unsettling and uncertain, and has all sorts of unexpected terrain features to it, and not knowing how I'm going to be led or be moved through it. And I think it's such a incredible thing that you do, Nora. I'm curious. Well, that's a straight hour. Nora, do you have any other things that you would like to say, or do you have any ways that you'd like to end our dialogue?
Well, I really appreciate everyone coming and being patient with the technical difficulties that arose. I don't really have, I just appreciate that anyone reads anything I write at all. And so thank you for that, Michael, and for being interested enough to invite me and to talk about these lofty subjects.
Thank you, Nora. Thank you so much. Thanks. I hope a lot of people do pick up copies of both Presence Detection System. I know that Mark Johnson, I see traces of Mark Johnson on the YouTube feed, who does the incredible Hiding Press out of Philadelphia. And, I thank you for publishing Nora's incredible book, Presence Detection System. And thank you for all of the incredible work that you do on so many fronts, Mark. I'm really happy to say that a future book in the document series will be Mark Johnson's Poor Fridge. I'm hoping in post-pandemic times, if they come, or that we'll be able to have both Nora and Mark read together here in Montreal, or to create some kind of dialogue between your two books, because I think there's a lot to explore together there. So again, Nora's book is The Display. It's available through Anteism. Anteismbooks.com, I think, is the site, or anteism.com. Thank you all for joining. Thanks too for weathering with us the initial technical difficulties. We're trying to get a new and exciting apparatus set up here at Anteism. So hopefully we'll have that worked out in the coming weeks. Coming up in 2 weeks, actually, we're going to be meeting with Craig Dworkin. I know that anyone who is listening now will want to join in a discussion of Craig's work. Craig has 2 new incredible books out. Radium of the Word on materialist poetics, and a second critical book coming out called Dictionary Poetics Towards a Radical Lexography. The ever brilliant and wonderful poet and theorist and archivist Craig Dworkin will be joining us from Utah. So thank you so much. Thank you, Nora, again. And have a good day, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.